I will begin with a question for you, because I understand most of you study international politics or relations, but with also a view to saving the environment. So you also are mostly interested in sustainability. And this question is about, so the question is, how many international environmental treaties do you think there are in the world? So like Paris Agreement, Convention on Biological Diversity, Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, etc., etc. These are some of the major ones, maybe some of which you have heard of, but there are lots of other smaller ones. Can anyone guess how many, what some people refer to as multilateral environmental agreements are out there? Any guesses? Anyone? Yes?
100?
100? Yeah, that's a good guess. Yes, that's a good start. I mean, maybe increase a little bit, off a little bit. Anyone? Yeah, 500. Still up a little bit. Yes.
1,000.
1,000. Yeah, that's a good number. Actually, I'd like to, maybe let's say that's the answer. I mean, it depends on what you exactly count as MEAs, multilateral environmental agreements. But if you count those ones that are really like that require legal ratification by the states, these are conventions and protocols, and there are 800 of them, around 800. And if you count also amendments, which are modifying the conventions and protocols, then the number goes up to 1,300. And if you also count the bilateral agreements, not just multilateral, and then the number goes up to 3,000, even more. So the point is that there are lots and lots of international agreements that 200 governments have negotiated and adopted, and some of them ratified and implementing. Which require themselves some coordination, because I mean, so the EU governments agreed on agreements like Paris Agreement to make sure that countries can collaborate and cooperate to tackle climate change and other environmental problems. But now the situation is that we have so many of those agreements, institutions, loosely speaking. We need to also have some sort of mechanism or way to coordinate and get them to cooperate. So it's a kind of a second order problem, if you like. So first order problem is international cooperation. Second order problem is institutional cooperation, which I'm going to talk about today. I'm not sure how many of you are actually familiar with this concept, planetary boundaries. Can you raise your hand if you have heard of this concept? Because I'd like to sort of also have an understanding of what type of audience I'm speaking to. So do you know this concept? Anyone? No? Just one person? Okay. So you guys are not so interested in that in the environment. So where to begin? So just to explain this in simple terms, planetary boundaries are the most important, let's say, environmental issues at the planetary scale. And Earth system scientists, the leading ones out there, they have picked and agreed that there are about 9 of them, including climate change, ocean acidification, biodiversity loss, freshwater use, land system change, etc. And for humanity to prosper and survive into the long into the future, these 9 processes must be protected from human intervention, human interference. They have defined, also identified some sort of a threshold, the tipping points, which must not be transgressed if the system were to remain intact. I mean, these individual system, climate system, etc. And they say some of them actually, we have pushed the boundaries too much, and we have actually stepped over the boundaries. In the case of biogeochemical cycles, in the case of biodiversity loss, in the case of climate change, we are in a dangerous territory so to speak. Whereas this circle, inner circle here, is a safe operating space for humanity. And another point, this conceptualization, the conceptual framework of planetary boundaries highlight is that these processes, although these are presented as like sort of segments of pie, these are interacting with one another, and you may have it set sort of, well, they may kind of reinforce each other and then worsen the other boundary, so to speak. Another way to present this planetary boundary is to visualize. I mean, it can be visualized in a different way like this, so you can sort of understand the boundary as this line cutting across the diagram. And what they're saying, what Earth system scientists are saying, is the Earth system is at this point in time. So we are, with humanity mainly, have been pushing the Earth system out of the Holocene basin of attraction, Holocene state, which has allowed humanity to prosper over the 10,000 years. And what we are doing at the moment with all the economic activities, industrialization, is that we have pushed their system out of the Holocene basin and into a unknown, more dangerous and hostile basin of attraction. And it's unclear, well, it's more or less clear actually, if we continue the business as usual activities, we will be pushing the Earth system into unsafe future. What Earth system scientists are saying, arguing that we need to steer the direction of the Earth system into a safe and just planet future. And this intervention or steering of the Earth system dynamics needs to also happen at the planetary scale. And therefore, there are social scientists who are calling for the need for a new type of governance model, which is referred to as Earth system governance. So it's a new paradigm of governance in the Anthropocene. Anthropocene, I don't know if you guys know this concept or not. Okay.
It's on your previous slide.
Oh, the Anthropocene, sorry, I didn't explain that. so it's, yeah, we are in the Holocene and we are moving into the Anthropocene. So the Anthropocene is the geological epoch where humanity is the main driving force behind global or planetary change. So we are now, well, scientists are saying that we are now entering a new geological epoch of the Anthropocene, the age of humans. And in the Anthropocene, we need to have a new governance model, which is referred to as Earth system governance, for steering societies towards preventing, mitigating, and adapting to Earth system transformations from a planetary perspective. This planetary perspective is important because the whole planet is changing. Whereas before, well, always it's been for millennia, people have been changing the environment, but mostly at a local to national to regional scale. But now, with the increase in influence of humans through economic activities, we are changing the face of the planet. So we need to have a planetary perspective when it comes to governing their system, and to be able to, and ultimately to steer the course of the Earth system into a more safe and just planet. So, like I mentioned before, planetary boundaries are interacting with one another. All the institutions out there are also interacting with one another, and therefore there's a need to coordinate these institutions to make their system governance more effective. But to sort of highlight that, to drive that point home a little bit more explicitly, I would like to speak about what is the nature of challenge requiring institutional coordination, especially in the Anthropocene context. So in this diagram on the left-hand side, you have all the global drivers. Urbanization, nuclear proliferation, international terrorism, well, increase in use of fossil fuels. I mean, these global drivers are resulting in unwanted social environmental problems, which are on the right-hand side, like climate change, ecosystem degradation, etc., economic crisis, etc., which need to be addressed by addressing the global drivers, right? I mean, we are trying to address these issues by addressing the global drivers, but these unwanted outcomes themselves are also interacting with one another, which makes the coordination challenge or the efforts, the coordination of the efforts to address these global drivers even more challenging and difficult. And I'd like to point your attention to the figures and the people also. The people here are, of course, the agents in system governance. These are the people who are trying to address global drivers, to address the unwanted outcomes. But I'd like to draw your attention to seizures in particular. And can you see what the seizures are doing in this picture? Just take it literally. I mean, the seizures, what are the seizures are doing? Humans, people are, cutting something. What are they cutting with the seizures? Yeah, so they're cutting the link between global drivers and some of the unwanted outcomes. Okay, so they're not, well, literally speaking, that these people are not getting to the bottom of the global drivers, but they are simply cutting the link between global drivers and unwanted outcomes, right? In this picture, maybe this wasn't the intention of the authors, but this is what the picture is showing. And this cutting of some links, to me, it's about addressing symptoms rather than root causes of environmental problems and other social ecological problems. So they can, for example, say, oh, we shouldn't go on and develop more and more nuclear weapons or nuclear energy, but rather they're saying we should cut the link between nuclear proliferation with ecosystem degradation using certain seizures as a way to govern and address unwanted outcomes. And what is the problem with that? If you address symptoms rather than root causes, what are you doing in the end? You may be just addressing symptoms rather than root causes, thereby not really addressing the issue as such, but maybe shifting the problem elsewhere or shifting problem into the future, for example. So addressing symptoms is not always the right approach to take, but this is what the diagram sort of suggests that we might be doing. And because of the increasing complexity of environmental issues, in my view, there are more and more seizures coming into policy. And that also means that these seizures, not just the efforts to address global drivers, but seizures themselves need to be coordinated. And this is another representation of planetary boundaries, which are interacting. This diagram shows how nine planetary boundaries are interacting through natural processes, but also through human-mediated processes, which are shown in blue. And depending on what you exactly do to address one planetary boundary, you may actually be pushing the other planetary boundary even further. And one example is tree planting. This is a diagram that shows what happens if you plant a lot of trees. If you plant a lot of trees, then you could help absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, thereby address the issue of ocean acidification. But maybe depending on what type of tree you're planting, how many trees you plant, and where you plant these trees, you may actually be worse than some of the other planetary boundaries like geochemical flows and biosphere integrity. Can you think of an example where this might happen? Do you know where your biofuels come from? So this, the gasoline you put in to your car. Some of them say E9, E5, E10, which means there are some biofuel in that gasoline you put into your car. And do you know where this biofuel come from? Any ideas? Okay. So this biofuel come from places and countries like Indonesia or Brazil. I mean, let's say Indonesia, where a lot of biofuel plants have been planted, and where there was a natural forest sometimes. So you cut down a natural forest, rainforest, and you replace that natural forest with lots of same tree species which produce biofuel, thinking that you actually address climate change, but at the cost of biodiversity, of local environment, because you have actually cut down natural forests, and you have actually adversely impacted the local livelihood of people there, for example, where livelihood was dependent on the services that natural forest provided before. So that's an example of how tree planting might have adverse impact on other environmental issues like biodiversity and biogeochemical flows and also water scarcity. Because if you plant a lot of trees or biofuel crops in an area where there's not enough water, you also create water scarcity in that local area, local environment. So this is another example of how you might shift environmental problems by engaging with what seemingly is a nice idea. I mean, tree planting is generally recognized and regarded as a nice idea, right? But the point I'm trying to make is even tree planting, like green policies like tree planting, needs to be critically looked at for potential adverse impact that may be created. And also the policy, tree planting policy should be coordinated with other environmental policies if you want to have an overall positive impact from all the environmental policies that you might implement. Are you guys following? And okay, any questions so far? Is this something that you find interesting? I mean, the environmental issues, how they interact with one another, and therefore policies need to be coordinated. That's the basically message I'm trying to give so far. Good. So in my research, so this has been one of the main research questions. So how do we design then institutions that can effectively coordinate across complex institutional and geographical boundaries? What does effective coordination look like? So this has been one of my main research questions, and of course, this question can be addressed at various levels. I mean, from local to international, but my research is mainly at the international level, by focusing on the interaction between the 1,000 international environmental institutions or treaty regimes that we have at the international level, like the climate treaty, and to get them to work with one another. I mean, this is an example from climate change, and you have many more of those decision-making fora at the international level. And how do you get these decision makers sitting in this room thinking about climate change to think about other issues as well? I mean, biodiversity loss. But if they are so much focused on addressing climate change, they may just say, "Oh, okay, let's do solar geoengineering, or let's plant a lot of biofuel crops, just so that we don't use fossil fuel too much." The point is that if they decide to do this, I mean, they are actually creating problems for other parts of the environment. So how do we get them to cooperate and coordinate themselves? That has been a key question. But before I sort of share some of the answers to this question, how do you coordinate and what does coordination how does effective coordination look like. I'd like to also explain a little bit about the structure of global governance, what the global governance system looks like. And this diagram here on the right-hand side is a figure that I have in one of the in a book I co-edited with Frank Bierman called Architectures of Earth System Governance. And by architecture, we mean massive institutional structure we can find in global governance, which consists of, maybe you have heard of this concept before, regime complexes, clusters of regimes, which this big circle here, which interact with one another, but which individually also consists of international organizations, treaty regimes, bilateral initiatives, non-state transnational networks, etc., which also interact with one another and which are also themselves systems of a smaller building blocks. And so we have a very massive, complex system or structure which is nested, within which you can find smaller building blocks, smaller building blocks, smaller building blocks, which interact with one another. Basically, the system is very complex, very complicated. And why does it look as it does? Some answers on this slide as well, but it looks very fragmented, complex, because it's not, it doesn't have a very clear structure, or it doesn't have a blueprint, because basically, essentially, nobody, there's no one single architect of the architecture. It emerged from bottom up through many different institutions that got negotiated and adopted separately. Whenever there was an issue on the news or on the minds of politicians or negotiators or general public, when there was climate change, when climate change emerged as a big problem, governments got together and negotiated a climate treaty. And most recent example, one of the most recent examples is Minamata Convention of Mercury. So when people started paying attention to mercury as an issue to be addressed, governments got together and agreed on this Mercury Convention. And what's on the horizon? Do you know the next treaty that we might have in the next 2 or 3 years? Yes, plastics. Plastics negotiation for this plastic treaty is starting next week or this week. I don't know exactly when the date is, but it's going to start very soon, with a view to concluding this agreement in the next 2 years. Again, I mean, plastic, depending on how you look at it, plastic is a big issue which requires a new treaty, or it could be seen as a very specific issue. Why do we need to create yet another treaty for that also? Why don't we use some of the existing 800, 1,000 treaties to fill this gap? Or why do we need to create a new treaty? Anyway, so this is how the system has evolved and developed over the years, like by taking a piecemeal or ad hoc manner or approach to law development. So these are some of the examples, main examples of major MEAs that we have: desertification, climate change, endangered species protection, wetlands, migratory species, etc. They form smaller clusters around biodiversity-related institutions, etc. And then they interact with one another, which form a bigger structure. This is a network visualization of 747 MEAs, which I met 9 years ago by using citations found in treaty text. So, sometimes treaty can refer to another treaty because they recognize the link between the issue they're trying to address with the issue that the other treaty is trying to address. So by looking for these cross-references or citations, I created this network, and this is one, could take this as a one visualization of among many possible visualizations of the treaty network. And then if you add, so these are all the MEA, so environment. So this is each dot here you find all environmental treaties. The right-hand side, the red ones are environmental treaties. So this is that red network there is essentially this network, and this blue network is trade agreements. So of course, maybe you have heard of this link between trade and sustainability or environmental issues, and these trade agreements and environmental agreements also talk to each other, communicate with each other through references again. And if you map this all, it looks like this. So, and then what do you see? The systems, the one hand, and the system on the other hand, are not too separated. They are kind of really close to each other, right? And to the extent you may actually say it's difficult to draw a boundary between the two systems. And this, and increasingly we see in global governance, we increasingly see more and more of those merger and collisions of different architectures and regimes, and there are more and more interactions, which also again is indicative of the interlinkages between issues. But also it does mean that the coordination challenge is becoming more and more difficult because there are more and more things to coordinate. And if you, at the most largest scale, so this is another network that I worked on with a PhD student. And here each dot is an internationalization, and the link is the hyperlink we found on their websites. So whenever there's one organization referring or directing you to another organization through a hyperlink, we draw a line, or less, and that's just to put it simply. And then we mapped the system of a network of 2,200, around 50 international organizations. And this you can see as also one visualization of the system of global governance at the most kind of largest scale possible. So this is what the system looks like. This is some of the visualizations of global governance. That's helping. And the question is, how do you coordinate? I mean, what do these structures mean to begin with? I mean, what does it tell us about their functioning, about their dynamics, about the effectiveness, about the for example, global south and north dimension, and this equity dimension, for example, also. And what does it also imply for coordination challenge? These are some questions that many of researchers in this field are grappling. And some of the scholars use concepts like fragmentation, polycentricity, complexity to make sense of the complex structures that we find in the system. And also some of us, I mean, especially me, I take a network approach. So as you saw before, I like to map things systems in network forms and analyze using network techniques, be able to understand the structures and say something about their structural properties. Are they fragmented? Are they complex? Are they polycentric? And maybe I'd like to ask, I mean, have you come across this concept before? Polycentricity, fragmentation, complexity? No. Well, there are lots of overlaps between these concepts, but they're also different. They mean different things. I don't think I'll need to or have the time to explain in detail, but well, they highlight fragmentation. What comes to your mind? I mean, when somebody says the system of institutions is fragmented, it has sort of a negative connotation that this system is divided into very different pieces, therefore it's not probably functioning well. So that, well, the word itself has negative connotation, although people contest that fragmented systems are not necessarily a bad thing. Same goes with the concept of polycentricity. Polycentricity highlights that there are connections between different parts, but some also question whether polycentric systems are necessarily well functioning. I mean, if it is well functioning, under what conditions are they really working as a polycentric system? And it's the same with the complexity. So complexity, I mean, it has also maybe negative connotation. Sometimes things are too complicated, too complex. But you know, complexity is you can also understand complexity as order that emerged from bottom up. You know, things look very complex. The network structures that I showed you before are very complex, but you can also find regularities in these structures also. So when did this order emerge, and what does it imply for these systems? I'm starting to lose some of you. Again, I think I didn't know that. I think most of you are first year, second year bachelor students. Yeah. Sorry. Second. So if I knew that before, I may have changed. So, so this is, of course, if you don't follow, that's totally fine, because this is that I wouldn't, you know, share in a lecture. But at least if some of the things that I mentioned and say stimulate your interest, I think that would be that's really nice. And maybe in the future, if you do master thesis or bachelor thesis, if you remember this moment and say, oh, this guy who talked about fragmentation was really interesting, I maybe write a thesis on it, and you can do so. That's my hope. But yeah, I think I have too many jargons in today's presentation, but hopefully I'm not losing all of you. Yeah, well, how can I make it as interesting as possible? Yeah, so I mentioned these three concepts: fragmentation, polycentricity, and complexity. There's still a lot of debate in academic literature between researchers like Professor Orsini and myself and other researchers in the field, which is most useful concept. How do you even measure fragmentation, complexity, polycentricity, and what does it mean? Is it really fragmented? So what can we do? How do we reduce fragmentation? How do we increase polycentricity, etc., etc.? These are questions that have no right answers to, and researchers are still trying to understand this. But let's just pick one concept: fragmentation. And well, I think there's sort of general consensus that, at least from a effectiveness point of view of this system of institutions in addressing environmental problems, well, apparently and obviously these have not been effective, right? I mean, we still have global environmental problems out there which are actually worsening. So this system of institutions have not been effective. From that perspective, some argue that the system is too fragmented, overly fragmented, because, well, when we address climate change as an issue, we're not paying sufficient attention to biodiversity issue, for example, vice versa. So in that sense, I think there are actually more fragmentation between institutions than we would like to have. Again, pointing to the need to coordinate system and get the institutions to collaborate and coordinate with one another. Then you might ask why that's the case. I mean, why are institutions not really working with one another? Why is institutional coordination such a difficult challenge? And I maybe should have I didn't this answer my own answers, but there are more answers to this question, big question, but I'd like to maybe point to two things. One is that the coordination mechanism, to the extent we have at the international level between institutions, is more or less self-organized form of coordination. So you ask treaties to talk to each other, share information, and really try to work with one another without having a central organization, which we have for some other issue areas like trade. We have the WTO, which is a big central organ, also playing a coordinator role between many different smaller trade agreements and institutions. But in the domain of the environment, we don't have such a strong, powerful organization. There's an absence of central coordinator. And the other issue I might point to is legal autonomy. I mean, this is a shared issue across also other domains, but individual treaties, they are legally autonomous because each of them have separate membership. So whenever there is a talk of need to coordinate the CBD, Convention on Biological Diversity, on the one hand, with the climate change treaty, guess who is raising the hand and say we shouldn't talk about climate change in biodiversity forum and vice versa. We shouldn't talk about biodiversity in climate forum. The answer is also already obviously on the map. The USA, why do you think that's the case? And what allows the USA to do that from a legal perspective, at least? Maybe. Yeah. Because this, sorry, yes.
No, but I know the answer, but I don't want to.
Sure. Maybe I should give you a prize for any interaction you make. Because the USA is not party to the CBD. USA is not a party to the Convention on Biological Diversity, and therefore they want to keep climate discussions out of the CBD, and vice versa as well. I mean, because I can say I am not part of the CBD, so why I don't want to talk about biodiversity. I mean, it's not within the mandate of the convention. It's not something I signed up for, right? So that's another barrier to institutional coordination. And of course, I didn't mention this on the slide, but there's also fragmentation at the national level. Who is included there? Like I mentioned, there are 800 MEAs, and many of those MEAs have COPs, like the climate COP that just happened before in Egypt in the past 2 weeks. Who from the national government of Belgium, let's say, goes to this climate COP? Maybe you guys have a separate ministry for climate change. Not too sure. Maybe, but many countries do actually, right? Maybe actually this issue is such an importance. Ministry of Foreign Affairs goes to this COP. But who goes to the negotiation of biodiversity? Do you expect the same people to go or different people to go from the national government? Usually it's a different people, different government negotiators who goes to different COPs, different negotiations, and they don't really also talk to each other that much at the national level. So there's also fragmentation at the national level, which translates to fragmentation at the international level. And we have a complicated picture where things are happening in silos across all levels. And I might also point to, I'll try to wrap things up pretty soon. I might also point you to other maybe reasons why I think there's a barrier to effective institutional coordination between environmental institutions, in particular One, I think, is the assumption that most people have that environmental institutions, policies, these are inherently green. So it's a matter of always implementation rather than coordination. So if you have green institutions, I mean, if you believe in the greenness of these institutions, you just want to say, I do what they tell you to do, and implement the obligations under these treaties without worrying too much about side effects. What happens if I plant many trees, for example? What happens if I only use biofuel? What happens if I for example? Sorry?
Nuclear power.
Oh yeah, what happens if we just build nuclear energy power plants and hope that nuclear energy will solve climate change energy issue? Then I think we should be made more critical about greenness of environmental institutions in that sense, because they may create other negative consequences. And this green assumption I call it has hindered us from delving into and taking coordination question more seriously compared to implementation problem. I mean, people talk about compliance and implementation all the time. Of course, it's really important. Of course, we don't have enough implementation, enough compliance, enough enforcement. But also at the same time, I believe coordination is as important as implementation. And the other thing that I want to try, I mean, the other underlying reason why we don't have as much coordination as possible as we could have is the assumption under international law against normative conflict. Which means, again, similar thing, but human rights, environment, what are the other norms? I mean, all the norms that we have in the SDG framework, all the good norms, 17 goals and 169 targets. These are norms, most of them actually are norms that are recognized under the international law. But do we often think about how these norms might actually conflict with one another? Not much until the SDGs came about. Maybe this is not new to you because you of the SDG era, I guess. But before the SDGs came about in 2015, not much attention had been paid to trade-offs between these global goals or norms or priorities. But more recently, people have been starting to pay attention to how these norms, global goals, might conflict. As you can also see from this diagram, I think, goals. Do you remember which goals are environmental goals in the SDGs? 13, 14, 15 are environmental. 13 is climate change, 14 is terrestrial biodiversity, land, life on land, and 15 is life on the sea, on the water. And so these boxes, so these orange bits show how much trade-off happens when you implement climate goal with number 6 is also water. So I think, yeah, or energy. Water energy anyway. So trade-off happens between between environmental goals as well. So this is something that people have been starting to pay attention to, and therefore maybe there's a need to also not anymore assume there is more normative conflict between international institutions. And therefore, we need to have more effective tools to address normative conflicts. Like, okay, obvious big issues are climate change and biodiversity loss. And which one do you prioritize? It's a normative judgment you have to make. And there's no effective tool that is available in the international legal toolbox for us to address these normative conflicts. Gender equality and something else, I mean, education, maybe. These also, in certain situations, these norms also may collide. Just sharing what I think comes to my mind. But the point is, we should have also a principled approach to addressing normative conflicts. And in the end, because of the absence of all these tools and the attention to coordination, it is not yet clear whether this complex system that I showed you before at the global level, regime complexes, architectures, 3D regimes, whether they work in synergy. In the end, we are only shifting back to each other, whether what happens in this system is all problem shifting, really not addressing the causes and address the problems. But I think I actually have more slides to share and talk about what should institutions look like for effective coordination. But I'll just run through this really quickly because I think these are more technical. Yeah, we have a question, but I'll run through this quickly and then we leave some time for discussion. Okay, question, yes.
Why you're not talking about the economic impacts of the new approaches that are being taken?
Why am I not talking about it? Is yes, it is a very big issue. Really, the simple answer is that's not my focus of research. I mean, it doesn't mean that I think it's less important or not important. So of course, everyone has their own area of research. But what I'm particularly interested in is what happens between environmental institutions, because I think some people might say that is something that is already researched. But I think in my view, it's actually the opposite. People have paid attention to the link between, for example, trade and environment a lot over the past 2 or 3 decades. But because of what I mentioned, there's a green assumption. I think people tend to assume that, that they only mostly environmental institutions mostly create synergy rather than trade-offs. So that's why I'm interested in interaction between environmental institutions in particular. But of course, they create economic impact, social impact, which is very, very important. So in implementing climate treaty, for example, you may actually worsen gender equality somewhere in global south, etc., or global north, which I leave up to other researchers to explore. Exactly. So that's yeah, the reason. Yes.
But on your research on the SDGs, there is one SDG on economic development.
Yes, yes,
So
yes.
if you look at trade-offs and interactions with this one.
Yes. So SDGs allow us to look into these trade-offs between 3 pillars of sustainable development. But I pay less attention to that in my own research. Of course, I do research also on SDGs. I do look at this economic and social dimensions. In some of my work today, I want to speak less about pillar interactions. Okay. So how do we manage institutional complexity? This is an ongoing research area where we are not short of proposals and ideas. Actually, there are so many ideas how we might do better, how we might increase coordination. I'll go through some of them. So one is through contextual design, which is basically to say when you introduce a new institution like Plastics Treaty or another treaty that is about to be concluded early next year is the Treaty on Marine Biodiversity in the high seas, areas beyond national jurisdiction. Whenever we introduce a new piece of the puzzle to the system, a new institution, we need to make sure that it kind of is not yet another fragment that is being added to it, but it's something that will actually help enhancing coherence of existing institutions. So if this lady, for example, enters this lift, will she become a centrifugal force that brings people together in that lift, for example? or is she going to be yet another piece or the person that people push away, so to speak? And there are legal techniques that you can use to make sure that this becomes a piece of the puzzle that is not simply further fragmenting the system, but becomes a part of the system. And another technique or method you could use is to redesign existing institutions rather than keep adding new institutions into the network or system of institutions. One example is the idea to repurpose the UN Trusteeship Council, which has not been functional for many decades because it served the purpose why it was created. But it's still there. It's not fully dismantled. It's not just operational anymore. But why? So then some people propose that why don't we give it a new life by giving it a new mandate for the environment, for sustainability, rather than creating for example, a World Environment Organization, which I mentioned as a possibility as something that we could have in the environmental domain, like WTO, something like WHO, something like ILO, which we don't have in the environmental domain. All we have is UNEP, which is a program, which is not a full-fledged international organization. Rather than having a WEO, why don't we just repurpose UN Trusteeship Council of a similar function? And another proposal idea is to create cross-cutting institutions or interagency coordinating mechanisms that might help coordinate fragmented pieces. Yeah, again, WEO might be an example we don't have yet. There are also other examples from the past. Joint liaison group, which was created to coordinate the 3 Rio Conventions on biodiversity, desertification, and climate change. Joint COP is another model we could also emulate for other areas where the separate decision-making bodies on the 3 separate treaties came together and held a joint COP. Make decisions that pay attention to what happens under other treaties. So there are these examples, and one of the most recent examples is the SDG indicator custodianship, by which some of the international organizations held their hand up and volunteered. I want to be custodians of some SDG indicators, and these international organizations got together with a view to coordinating the work of many national governments, different institutions, NGOs, etc. So the groups of international organizations serve as coordinators, but then, of course, they themselves are also in need of coordination. Some are more fragmented, some are less fragmented, so the coordinating mechanisms are sometimes also in need of coordination. I think I'll, just last slide. So institutionalized strategies of orchestration will also be an answer to institutional coordination challenge. Here I'm thinking about the SDGs and especially the high-level political forum, which is serving as an orchestrator of other international organizations when it comes to SDG implementation. It's not probably very effective and strong. It's not given a strong mandate or resources, but if it were given mandate and resources, maybe it could serve as a very strong central coordinating body of myriad international organizations that we have. And SDGs themselves as orchestrator, maybe you can think of conceptualized SDGs are also themselves orchestrating very many efforts that happen in different contexts and settings. Move some resources towards achieving certain SDGs. And SDGs themselves are meant to be a single unified framework. They're not meant to be implemented in separate in silos. So SDG as a whole is a framework that can be seen as orchestrated. And then the question is, from a research point of view, has it served as such? Is it really effective? Has it been effective as orchestrators? So under what conditions? If not, why? So these are, well, some of the things that I wanted to share. I think I time than I should have, but I hope you enjoyed. At least found some of the ideas interesting. Thank you very much.